Hello and welcome to the Eat Like Ruby podcast. I am here today by myself doing a solo episode and I'm going to rip straight into it today. If you are new to the podcast, welcome. I'm stoked to have you here. If you're a long-term or an OG or a regular listener, I am even more stoked to have you here. And I am going to jump into a solo episode today with a little bit of a mindset chat. But really, I've got kind of three things that I want to speak about that I see play out hugely with nutrition, but also with training. And I really want to hone in on like a little bit of the mindset stuff with these. And I think this is going to be so beneficial for beginners or people who are sort of maybe struggling or just a bit lost with dieting. I think this is going to be some cool stuff to think about, whether you're still in that kind of lost, struggling phase or whether you've kind of stepped away from that, hopefully from everything you're learning from the pod, and you're sort of starting to dabble in doing things a new way, which is awesome. I think this episode will be so beneficial for people in those positions because this can be some really common stuff we see play out with the mindset, but there is especially one element here. I'm going to speak to three things in particular, and one of them I think is a really important thing for our experienced and our advanced girls to think about as well. And like always, the other two still might be applicable because everyone's in such a different position with their nutrition and training, and everyone's at such a different stage of their own personal timeline and journey, but then also we work through different goals and we navigate different things at different times. So even though you might consider yourself experienced or advanced, there might be something that's just come up for you recently that's a struggle, or you might find I'm really good with everything until I enter this goal or this phase and then I struggle with XYZ. So I never want to speak too much to this is only for beginners or this is only for advanced, because we might be beginners in some elements but advanced in others and vice versa. And then, like I said, we might struggle with different things at different times. We might kill it with different things at different times. So I think there's definitely going to be something in this episode for everybody. And I think this is just a really cool thing to tap into and to kind of clock where you're at and if there's any work you need to do around these three things in particular. And the first thing I want to speak to, number one, is the concept of good and bad foods. And we've spoken about this so much over the years. We've spoken about this recently. We speak about it in lots of different ways, or the role that it plays at different times in different phases, etc. But I really just want to speak to this as a whole because I think this is something especially that beginners really need to kind of get their head around and understand a little bit more, because there's so much to look at here. And what I really want to just start with is, if you've listened to the podcast before, you'll know my number one saying is there's no right or wrong. We cannot just sit there and say, this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is bad. And we cannot do this with individual foods or food groups as a whole. And the reason for this is because what is, quote, good for a person with one specific goal might not be so good for a person with another goal, and vice versa. But even then, when we have people working towards fat loss, we have to understand that it is no individual food or it's no individual thing that's making or breaking a successful fat loss phase. If we think about the fact that fat loss comes down to energy balance, aka calories in versus calories out, which we've spoken about so much on the podcast before, we'll speak about it again. But if we really think about the fact that that is going to be the deciding factor of fat loss, and it is the diet as a whole that makes up our total energy balance, aka how many calories are coming in, no single food is going to be responsible for making or breaking a fat loss phase, like I said. And often what we can sort of see here is people really pinpointing those common foods, like maybe a food group or a bigger food as a whole, like sugar or carbs, or honing in on particular things like chocolate or biscuits or chips or bread or pasta. Anything at all. I think we've all heard all of these things come up at some point and been like, this food is, quote, bad for people wanting to lose weight, people with a fat loss goal, etc. And if we keep looking at that from the fat loss perspective for a second, if we come back to fat loss being energy balance, calories in versus calories out, it can't just be like, oh my God, you had sugar, your fat loss is going to come undone. Oh my God, you had a chocolate biscuit, fat loss is going to come undone. You had a piece of bread, there goes your fat loss. Again, it's the diet as a whole that is giving us that total energy intake and therefore creating our energy balance and therefore deciding our fat loss phase. So that's just a really important thing to just clock initially and understand before anything else, because it's just so common to think that those foods are, quote, bad. and therefore they can't be included when we're working towards a fat loss goal, which we know they absolutely can. If you don't follow me, eat_like_Ruby, you should, because you'll see straight away, like I've had many successful fat loss phases, literally eating Nutella every single day. We have so many girls in Eat Like Ruby that achieve wicked fat loss results by having a truly flexible diet and including all foods in moderation, and including all foods they enjoy. So if you're someone who just thinks of foods as good, bad, right, and wrong, especially for specific goals, it's just important to really clock that and understand that no individual food is going to give a certain result or ruin a certain result. Again, we have to come back to the diet as a whole. And this is why I'm such an advocate of flexible dieting, because we can design a diet as a whole that lets us work individual foods in and out as we please, not just deeming them like they have to be in or they have to be out. And I've said this before, but it's absolutely worth saying it again. We have to really tap in and think, well, what do I think is happening in the body when these foods are consumed? If we think about the food consuming food, taking it in, taking in the energy, whatever, taking in the sugar, the carbs, whatever we're looking at, the body isn't just happily chipping along and then going, oh my God, that's a piece of bread, that's a biscuit, you've just ruined all of your results. And that sounds so random and so funny when we understand nutrition. So there's probably a lot of experienced girls kind of laughing or just having a little chuckle at that. And you're probably laughing thinking, yeah, I did think that once upon a time, right? And everyone has. That's why I'm sitting here talking about it. And if you're someone who is thinking that right now, thinking, I have a weight loss goal or I have a fat loss goal, if I was to consume bread, sugar, pasta, chocolate, biscuits, lollies, whatever it is that you're personally thinking, what do you truly think is happening in the body when that food comes in? Because like I said, the body is not just clocking it and then going, oh my God, that's a piece of bread, that's a bowl of pasta, etc. Move it straight to the stomach or the thighs or anywhere that we're storing body fat. That's not how fat loss occurs. And I don't want to get into the fat loss chat today because like I said, we've spoken about it so much and we're going to speak about it again. But when we understand this, and if we don't, that's totally fine. You could be here for the first time. That's awesome. Welcome. You've got plenty to learn and I've got plenty to teach. So you're in the perfect place. But when we do understand this, we can really move away from that good, bad mentality because we understand, no, it's my diet as a whole that's going to move me towards a certain goal. And that's obviously going to look different. Like the diet as a whole is going to look different depending on the goal at the time. And any foods can come into that diet as a whole to move me in the direction that I want to go. And the other thing to clock alongside this is, again, with that good and bad food mentality, it's so common to assume that everybody wants to achieve fat loss and weight loss. And if you've been wanting to achieve this your whole life, or you've been trying to achieve this your whole life, it makes sense because it's probably just your mentality all the time. But really, when we think about this, like how often do we see people just looking at a food, and maybe you're in a social setting or you're at work or whatever, and a food comes up and someone goes, that's so bad for you. That's such a blanket statement. Like, that's so bad for you. If we really look at that sentence, that's so bad for you. The you that we're talking about is going to be different. If we think about, like I said before, what's bad for a person who has a fat loss goal versus what's bad for a person who's trying to gain weight, what's bad for a person who sits down all day, what's bad for a person who runs all day, we can't just say that's bad for you. And think about like how many people just throw that statement around all the time. Oh my God, that food's so bad for you. Like the you that you're talking about is different. There's like how many billion people on the planet? We can't just deem something bad for you because the you is different in every scenario. So if you personally think like that, or you hear people talk like that, I think the number one thing, like the first step in someone's nutrition journey and getting nutrition education, and if you're new here, just know that nutrition education is literally the sole purpose of my existence. Like I was put on this planet to educate people about nutrition. So, and I think the number one step in getting nutrition education and really learning how to navigate your nutrition forever is really becoming aware and understanding that when people do say that's bad for you, or when you personally think that's bad for you, open your mind to the fact that a food being good or bad for someone is so subjective. meaning it's going to be different in every situation. And I think I could say this over and over because I feel like this is the number one thing that I want to drum into people and get people to understand is just being aware that when that exact comment gets thrown around, have something internal in your brain, like have a little flag in your brain that waves and go, hang on a minute. It's not just as simple as one food being good or bad. It's so dependent on the person, the goal, the diet as a whole. So many other factors are going to contribute to whether that particular food is optimal or maybe not so optimal to include in that person's diet at the time, to include in that person's day, etc. I can't stress this enough. So I think the main thing to really get here is just when you do hear other people say that, or when you do think that yourself, again, just wave that little flag and just go, hang on a minute. It's not just black and white. It's not just right, wrong, good or bad. And the reason I wanted to speak to the mindset side of this today is because we do speak so much about the tangible thing, about how fat loss is actually achieved, how we implement a flexible diet, how we include all foods in moderation. We've spoken about that so much. Again, we're going to speak about it so much more. But I think something that really cockblocks people from moving forward with their nutrition education is not clocking that initial fact and essentially being quite narrow-minded. And I don't say that to be rude. I'm not saying that to have a go, but open-mindedness will absolutely change the game for you when it comes to moving forward with nutrition. We can't be so narrow-minded to just look at things and be like good, bad, right, wrong, black, white, because like I keep saying, so many factors are going to contribute to that. No individual thing is going to be the deciding factor. And if we start to sort of come into the other angle of this that I keep saying, what's quote good for a person who has a fat loss goal is going to be different to a person who doesn't have a fat loss goal. If we think about, I'm going to use my husband as an example for a second here. If people don't know, my husband is, first of all, a lot taller than me, a lot bigger than me, and training for an Ironman. If we think about me being a 60 kilo female, let's say I had a fat loss goal, and then we think about my husband Shaq being a 200 centimeter male training for an Ironman, we couldn't just look at foods and go, these foods are good, these foods are bad, because it's like, what foods are going to be most optimal for me to work into my day to work towards my goal? It's going to be very different to what's optimal to work into Shaq's day to work towards his goal. And a really cool example of this is if we think about, at the moment, Shaq does some days that are 5,000 calories. 5,000 calories he's eating some days. If we think about the fact that, again, come back to that sort of narrow-minded blanket statement that people can make of like, this food is good, this food is bad. Often when we see things that are like sugar-free, low-carb, low-calorie, people can instantly make that connection of like, this food is, quote, good. If we think about a person trying to put away 5,000 calories a day, it is not good to load up on low-sugar, low-carb, low-calorie foods. He's going to need to eat an absolutely insane amount of food volume to hit that 5,000 calories. We actually want him to eat things that are high calorie, easy to digest, even if we look at the angle of people being like, you know, sugar is bad or simple carbs are bad and things like that. I've got Shaq on that many simple carbs because A, we're trying to get a high amount of total energy into his system, being the 5,000 calories. So if we loaded him up on really high volume, low fiber filling foods, he's going to be so full, there's no way he's going to get to 5,000 calories. So those simple high calorie foods that you can easily get into your system, so beneficial when the intake is high. And we also know that those foods are so beneficial to support training performance. And that's a really cool thing. Like we can segue into another topic there, but I'll stay with Shaq for 1 second. If we look at him being a person that needs to eat a lot of food, needs to get simple, good carbs into the system to prioritize his training. He's going out for 3-hour runs. He's going for like 2-hour bike ride straight into a 2-hour run. These big sessions, we want carbs coming in. If we were just giving him like apples and oats, he's going to A, not get that many calories in, so his energy is really going to dip. But B, if we think about the volume, how filling those foods are, they're going to come in and he's just going to be like, I'm so full. Like physically, my stomach is so full, it's so bloated, I can't get any more food in. And that's not what we want because we want him to get a ton of food in. So I know most of us aren't training for an Ironman. If you are, amen, go off. But it's just an important thing to, again, bring it back to that blanket statement of good, bad. That food is good for you, that food is bad for you. a lot of the foods that people would look at and go, that's so bad for you, are the exact foods I'm putting into his meal plan right now as a sports nutritionist trying to fuel my Ironman to do the coolest thing he's ever done in his life. I'm not going to sabotage it. I'm not going to put the wrong shit in there. So it's just a really important thing to clock. And another really cool example of that we could probably relate to a little bit more, because like I said, most of us aren't doing an Ironman. If you're a gym gal, especially if you're a gym gal that's dabbled in higher calorie / muscle gain phases, it is so common for people to think eating high calories would be awesome and so fun and so easy. And it is so insanely common to find it harder than you thought. And again, if we think about, let's say, I'm purely just going to use example numbers. We'll use my own. When I pursue fat loss, I eat around 1,600 calories. When I am at maintenance, it's around 2,200. When I pursue muscle gain, I start to get up into the high 2,000s. So often I've had females in a similar situation where they want to push muscle gain, so they're getting onto that higher intake up in the high 2000s. It's obviously different depending on the individual. But if you're someone who's spent a lifetime trying to eat low calories and then you go into an intentional higher calorie phase, it's so common for people to be like, oh my God, this is so much harder than I thought. And again, clock the fact that this person is trying to get in higher calories. They're trying to get good energy coming in for training. We don't want them to be only loading up on those low calorie, high fiber foods, etc. We absolutely can factor high fiber and good quality foods into the day. I feel like we're starting to get off topic if we go there. But if we think about that person, let's say we are used to planning 1,600-ish calorie days and ticking off good amounts of like fruit, veg, protein, fiber, all of the things we think about, right? And all of the things that people tend to deem like, quote, good foods. Those foods absolutely have good nutrients in them. They're good quality foods. They are absolutely worth including in your day, right? We've spoken about that before. Again, we'll probably speak about it again at some point. But if you're used to fitting all those things into your day on 1,600, maybe 1,800 calories, and then you find yourself up in the high 2,000s, you don't want to just keep loading up on more fruit, more oats, more veggies. You absolutely can increase your serving sizes of those things. But again, think about the fact that they are lower calorie, they're high fiber, which means they're usually high volume and filling. There's only so many of those things that you can keep including in your day until you hit a point where you're just like, I'm full. I can't eat more of these things. Again, bring it back to the fact that for your goal right now, you need to eat a certain amount of calories, or for people in this position, they need to eat a certain amount of calories to be in a surplus, start to promote muscle gain. Just including, quote, good foods is actually making it really hard for them to hit the amount of calories they need to achieve their goal. So are those foods that good? They have really good nutrients in them. They're good quality foods. They serve a good purpose in the diet. But it doesn't just make them, quote, good and any other foods bad. Come back to the fact that we flexible diet and it's our day of eating as a whole and our overall eating approach over time that's going to move us towards a goal. If we have a goal to eat more, we want to be open-minded to the fact that that can include any and all foods. And there's probably a lot of people sitting there going, well, I don't have a muscle gain goal. I'm not doing an Ironman. I'm not trying to eat high calorie. So what does all this mean for me being on a lower calorie diet or pursuing fat loss, etc.? It can be super beneficial when you're in that position to include lower calorie foods, focus on more filling foods, more volume, more fiber, all of those things that are going to fill us up. If we think about the fact we've got less calories to play with and we don't want to be too hungry, we don't want to have too lower energy, etc., obviously fitting in those foods is going to be ideal. But that doesn't mean the second we bring in a chocolate biscuit alongside them that everything's going to go to shit. And that's the most important thing to clock. If you're in a position where you're not working towards fat loss, you really want to start to understand and think about all of that stuff I just said with higher calories, whether that's maintenance, a surplus, whether you are going to do an Ironman, whatever it is. But if you are moving away from fat loss, your mentality should be moving away from fat loss as well, and understanding that you don't just have to load up on those foods that everyone sort of deems good, because most people are deeming them good. And I keep doing the little air quotes for people that are listening, not watching. Most people are deeming them good because most people think that everyone wants to work towards fat loss and weight loss. Like I said at the start, it's so common to just assume that that's everyone's goal, but it's not. So you want to open our mind to the fact that that's not everyone's goal. We want to open our mind to the fact that different things are going to be, quote, good for different individuals working towards different goals at different times, etc. And then we want to understand that it is the diet as a whole that is going to move us in a certain direction, even if that direction that we want right now is fat loss. Really understand that we can include those lower calorie, high volume foods like I keep talking about, and the things that we are probably in our mind deeming good, but there's room for other things to come into the diet alongside that as well. And depending on your goal, your targets, all of these things, that's starting to get into a different topic, but will depend on how many of each thing you can fit in. But again, that's literally flexible dieting. You look and you go, okay, cool, I want to tick off good quality foods. I want to make sure I'm quite satiated, I'm quite full, my energy is quite good. But I also understand that no food is going to make or break my diet. So if I really want to factor in a little bit of ice cream, a Tim Tam, etc., I absolutely can. Because again, I've opened my mind and I'm not just clinging to that blanket statement that people are making of that's so bad for you. And that was the first point that I really wanted to speak to. I feel like we've gone hard on it. I hope we've covered it enough for people to just, like I said, really all I want people to take from that is to just open the mind a little bit and understand that we don't want to be categorizing things as good, bad, right, and wrong. We want to understand nutrition. And this is why I'm such an advocate of nutrition education, because when we do understand it, we can decide what would be good or bad for us at a time, what might be optimal, not so optimal. And that can look different depending on the individual, the goal, but it can also just look different depending on the day. You might have a day where you've included certain foods and meals that add up in a way that you then go, okay, it doesn't make sense for me to have an ice cream tonight, include some chocolate today. You might then plan foods and meals on another day that add up a little bit differently. And you go, you know what, there's room here for some snacks. There's room here for some dessert. That is flexible dieting, and that is absolutely game-changing because A, when we understand that, we can actually work with it. We can design our own days. We can factor those things in if we want. We can take them out if we want. And B, if we think about all of that, we have choice. We get to decide what comes in, what comes out, what's the phase, what's the goal, what would work for me right now, what do I scale back on right now. If you think about comparing that to other diets where people are just going, oh my God, that's so bad for you. Anytime we hear that now, we should just have a little, like I said, we should have that little flag that waves and goes, don't buy into that. But then also just go, this person's got some work to do. And that's fine. They can do the work in their own time because I'm good. I'm doing my work. I'm learning and I'm changing the game with my nutrition. I am going to move on to point number 2 because I feel like we've hit that one hard enough. Point number 2 that I want to look at is the quote or the thing that sort of comes up where people go, consistency over perfection. The thing that I want to say about this is there is no right or wrong with this. We don't have to choose consistency or perfection. We absolutely don't have to aim for perfection with our diet, right? But we can have phases where we go, I'm really going to tighten this up. And I think that can get shamed a little bit by people that struggle to tighten things up, and they find that consistency over perfection thing quite soothing and quite comforting because they're like, okay, well, I can be consistent, but I struggle to be perfect. That's absolutely fine, and I'm going to come to that in a second. But if you are someone who really likes to prioritize their nutrition and training and likes to have phases where you really dial that in, like I don't want to use the word perfectly, but you dial it into a point where you're like, this is solid. This is on point, right? And if we think about, if you're an Eat Like Ruby and you know the way that I teach flexible dieting, I don't teach working towards exact numbers. So I don't think we need to quote eat perfectly in a way that's like eat X amount of carbs and X amount of this and X amount of that. To me, when I look at my own nutrition, a quote perfect day is a day where I've said, what do I need to do today to best move towards my goal? Reverse engineer that plan a day that works completely in line with that, get to the end of that day and go, I've just nailed what I think is the most optimal thing I could do right now for my goal. In my opinion, that's what is, quote, perfect. It's not about perfect numbers or perfect foods. It's about saying, what is the most optimal thing I can do today for my goal? Putting that in place, ticking that off, getting to the end of the day and going, hell yes, I nailed that. So that's the first thing I want to say, because I feel like that quote, like perfectly thing, can get shamed. And that's where we see consistency over perfection. You don't need to be perfect. You absolutely don't need to be perfect. Like I said, I don't think anyone needs to work towards exact numbers and work towards perfection in that way. And you also don't have to even do what I just said, where you're really on point and gunning it towards specific protocols or specific goals, but you can be. If that works for you and you really prioritize this stuff and you love it, that's awesome. Go off. I'm a big fan of that. And when I have a really specific goal, that's absolutely my approach and that's my mentality. So I'll always applaud that. especially if it feels good for the individual. And this is where I think I want to come back to that consistency versus perfection thing. And like I said at the start of that, I don't think one is right or wrong. I think it comes down to the individual. If you're an individual who loves this stuff and everything I just said for those last 2 minutes really appeals to you, and you're like, yep, when I go into a specific phase or goal, I nail it. And it feels great and I'm pumped and I'm motivated and it's positive and I'm just ripping in, that's unreal. Like, that's unreal in my opinion. So big yes to that. If you're a person who doesn't particularly love nutrition and training, that's absolutely fine. I've said so many times, you don't have to. I don't ever want to force this stuff down people's throat, but I think it's important to understand that we're going to be eating for the rest of our life. And ideally, we're going to be moving for the rest of our life. So we at least want to understand it enough and do it consistently and enough in a way that makes us feel good. And I think this is where consistency versus perfection doesn't have to be one is better than the other. I think it's what appeals to me more. Am I the sort of person that loves nutrition and training and I like to hone in on really specific things and get after it? Am I the sort of person that's maybe struggled with this stuff for a while, maybe really doesn't enjoy it, almost in a way kind of wants to just do the bare minimum that I have to do to get the result that I want and be happy enough? That's not wrong. I just want to make that so clear. If that's you and you think I just want to learn enough and have good enough stuff in place that, again, I can basically do the bare minimum but feel good about my choices and feel good about my results and be happy overall with the position that's leaving me in, that's absolutely not wrong. And I'm going to side note a little bit. I'll try not to get too ranty, but if we think about anything else in life, this is the approach people take. The thing that's coming to my mind is cars, right? And stay with me. Some people absolutely love cars. So they are meticulously cleaning their car, cleaning the engine, looking into what's the best stuff I can put in the engine, etc. Other people are just I just need my car to drive me around. I don't really care what's in the engine so long as it works, right? That's perfect. Neither one of those is right or wrong. If you love that thing, if you're a car lover and you're I just love to research this stuff and do the absolute best thing I can do for my car, that's so enjoyable for me. That's where I love to put my time and energy. That's awesome. And again, if you're on the other side and you just look at your car as a thing that gets you from A to B, that's not wrong either, so long as you look after it. And you do the bare minimum. You're I put fuel in it and I get the service every time the service light comes on, aka myself. But you don't have to be oh my God, I should be a car lover. If you're not, you're not. And that's totally fine. And I think it's important to just kind of clock where you fall with that. I think if you know, it kind of comes into your mind and you go, no, I do love this stuff. I love to look into it. I love to hear about it. I love to put certain things in place and fine tune and refine and elevate. That's unreal. I'm all for it. That's literally my life. But again, if you're someone who's no, I don't love this. I've tried to love it. I just don't. Tell me what I need to know to just get to a happy place and chip away and live the rest of my life. That's awesome as well. So just an important thing to understand. The other thing to think about there is you can go between these. You might have phases where you really go hard on specific protocols and you're refining things and you're elevating, etc. And then you come out of that phase, maybe you tick off the goal or something happens in your life and you think, okay, I'm going to move away from that for a while. I'm going to scale it back and I'm just going to focus on consistently hitting the gym and eating enough protein. This is why I say there's no right or wrong, because that approach is not wrong. If you've made the decision that is, quote, right for where you're currently at, that's awesome. And then on the flip side, if you make the decision that what's, quote, right for you at a time is to knuckle the F down and get after it, that's awesome as well. So coming back to my original point of consistency versus perfection, neither one is the, quote, right thing. You want to sort of look, where am I at? What is my goal? What type of person am I in this space? Am I someone that loves to really refine things and look into this stuff and really fine tune it? Am I not? And therefore, what direction do I want to go in here? And the last thing I'll say on that is if you're someone who is a beginner and you're sort of getting into flexible dieting and you're getting everything set up and you're sort of trying to find your groove with that, I think it's really common to sort of feel like you do have to aim for perfection, otherwise you've ruined it. And that's where, we can start to see the all or nothing mentality kick in and people are either on track or off track. I don't want to get too far into that combo today, but if you can relate to all of that, we can then start to see people bring up that, no, you don't have to be perfect, you just have to be consistent. What I would be thinking about here, I think people might have just heard everything I just said and thought, well, if I am a beginner and I am trying to find my groove and I'm trying to get results, how consistent do I have to be? How perfect do I have to be, right? The little side note I want to say on that is the more you learn about nutrition and the more you learn about your own body and your own nutrition and what works for you, the more you're going to feel in control of this stuff and the more you're going to feel like you can take it in any direction. Like I said before, you can really refine it. You can really scale it back at any time. So I can't stress enough how beneficial I think it is to learn about nutrition, but also really learn and collect data about what works for you and your goals to then feel like you can choose how consistent am I going to be at a time, how quote perfect am I going to be at a time, etc. You don't feel like a victim to consistency versus perfection. You feel like you get to choose how far you want to go in either direction, either time, right? That is absolutely worth doing the work to get to that point. But if we come back to someone who's quite beginner right now or trying to settle in with all this stuff and asking, do I have to be consistent? Do I have to be perfect? What does that have to look like? I think almost tying it into what I just said, we want to have enough consistency towards something that you can see how it works for you. If we think about setting up a calorie deficit or a surplus or maintenance or anything at all, trying to work out how your body responds to a certain intake, how your body responds to certain steps, how your body responds to a certain training program, you want to have done that thing enough to be able to say, this is what I did and this is how my body responded. We cannot say something, quote, didn't work if we didn't do it. So really reverse from that and think, if I want to know what my personal intake is for fat loss or what my personal intake is for muscle gain, etc., if I can't say something did or didn't work, if I didn't stick to it, I need to stick to something enough if I want to gather that information. And that's going to be so dependent on where you're at and your goal and everything. You might be starting to learn all this stuff and just thinking like, my goal right now is just learning. I just want to understand. I'm open to trial and error. I'm not really looking at physical progress. I'm not looking at body composition or fat loss or anything like that. I'm just in a learning and understanding phase. I couldn't speak more highly to that. Like, I'm literally giving you the amen hands in the air because that's unreal, right? So then there's certain things that you would do or wouldn't feel like you need to do because that's your goal. Alternatively, if we look at someone who is wanting to put protocols in place to work towards a specific goal like fat loss or muscle gain, body composition, training performance, anything like that, you are wanting to see how your body responds to different things. So again, you want to do that thing enough to be able to assess and deem what the response was. And the last thing I'll say here is it's completely up to you what goal you work towards, how much you want to implement, how consistent, how perfect you want to be, all of those things. But you do want to understand this stuff and you want to say, okay, if my goal is XYZ, let's say your goal is fat loss. If my goal is fat loss, the most optimal thing I could do to set myself up to achieve that is hit XYZ targets as consistently as I can, assess how my body responds to that, and know if I need to adjust. It's then up to you. When we look at the as consistently as I can, that's completely up to you. If you hit it every day, awesome, you're going to be able to assess it way better. If you don't, you're going to want to understand that at some point, the less consistent we are, the less refined we are, the less we actually hit something, like I said before, we can't then deem it, quote, working or not working. So just an important thing to understand, and I think the most beneficial thing we can do, especially if you're here and like I said before, especially if you're getting started with all of this flexible dieting, calories kind of chat, is really think about, okay, well, why am I here? What was the thing that made me listen, made me join whatever position you're in? What is it that I want to achieve? What does my life look like right now to set up my protocols and everything to achieve that? What do I have to do to implement that for enough time? I'd say like a few weeks. That's getting off topic. But what do I have to do to really implement something for a few weeks to get to a point where I can start to go, how's my body responding? How's my training responding? How's my hunger, energy, etc., depending on what it is that you're actually trying to assess. Because like I said before, the more information you can gather around those things, the more you're going to be in control of your nutrition for life. When you have done a consistent period of something and then assessed, okay, cool, when I do that, I achieve fat loss. Or and then you implement another thing like a maintenance intake, for example, and you watch how your body responds and you see it actually maintain and you go, yep, okay, cool. Now I know when I want to maintain, I do X, Y, Z. And you start to really gather that data on yourself. And then you find yourself in a position where, like I said before, I watch girls kill it and get to this point where they're just like, if I want to achieve fat loss, I do this. If I want to maintain, I do this. If I want to chill, I do this. When I am having a less refined period, I just focus on protein. Like, again, there's no right or wrong, but it really comes back to having information and data on nutrition and on what nutrition works for you, and then deciding where you take that at any time. And I think the best way we get that data, or the way we get that data, is to do things consistently enough and be adherent enough to actually ask that question, how is my body responding to this thing? And then you can decide how often you want to implement that thing and to what extent. But to get that initial information and make that initial assessment, we need that consistency, we need that adherence. And the last thing I want to speak to, number 3, this one will be a little bit shorter, so we're nearly done. But the last thing I want to speak to, and this is something that I think beginners definitely need to hear, but also our experienced or advanced girls could benefit from this as well. And that is really clocking what you would personally deem a quote good week. And the reason I bring this up is because I think it's so common, especially I see this more with beginners, but I think it can still play out with other people, is having a week where things maybe didn't go to plan, or you feel like you're still learning, so there's a bit of trial and error, maybe something come up and it completely derailed nutrition, whatever, like anything at all that's happened where you're just sitting there and you're like, I'm not that stoked with what played out this week, right? The actions and the actual tangible things that happened this week. But then hopping on the scale, seeing a number that you're quite surprised to see after the week you've had, and then going, it was still a good week. And pausing for effect. If you've had a week, especially if you feel like things didn't play out the way you wanted and it was kind of your fault, right? And I'm not saying that to have a go, but if you're sitting there going, I was going to hit X amount of steps and I didn't. I was going to eat more protein and I didn't. I went out on the weekend and ate something that I wasn't planning on eating, right? I'm not saying those things are wrong, but what I'm saying is if you got to the end of the week and you were looking back over your choices and your actions and you were like, they weren't really what I wanted them to be, right? You then get on the scale, see a number, like I said before, that you're quite surprised to see, like it's gone down. And then you go, oh, I didn't have like the best choices with this, this, and this, but it was still a good week because the scale went down. What I want to say here is, if your child cheated on a test but got an A, is that a good result or a bad result? Are we encouraging that child? Are we stoked with that child? Are we then saying, well, that was still a good test. That was a good week? Because that is so important to clock. I don't want to get into the scale weight combo today. That's coming. We've done that before and it's coming again. But what I really want people to think about is, what are you clocking in your mind as good and bad? And we can bring that back to that first point in the first comment about the foods and everything. What are we looking at as just good and bad? And really why? And would we deem the same thing for other people? Even if we don't have kids, if your mum or your sister or your friend or someone was just implementing sloppy things and just honestly not looking after themselves or their health, because that's really what it is. And the extent of that is going to be different depending on what your actual week looked like, right? But if you're not happy with your choices and your actions of that week, and you feel like they just weren't that supportive of your health and they just weren't the standard that you want to hold, you wouldn't be stoked to hear about your loved ones doing the same thing. You wouldn't be stoked if you've got, elderly parents, or you've got a sister or a best friend or someone who said to you, I'm not holding up my standards, I'm not looking after my health, but geez, I had a good week because the scale went down. Where would your mind go? Your mind would be like, mate, no. A good week should be looking after your health, upholding certain standards that you want to uphold for yourself, feeling good about yourself. You wouldn't deem their week, quote, good just because they saw a lower number on the scale. So clock that for yourself. Are you just deeming the week good or not good, depending on what the scale did? And like I said, we're not going to get into the scale weight combo today. We've done it before, it's coming again. But really think about that analogy of like, if the kid cheated on the test, would we deem the result good just because they got an A? Or would we look and go, yeah, but the way you got that A was terrible? And then same thing if you saw your loved ones eating and looking after themselves or not looking after themselves in that same way, would you go, oh, but it's totally fine because your scale went down? Or would you go, yeah, mate, we gotta look at your health and other things before we start deeming it a quote good week? I could talk about that all day, but I'm just going to talk in circles and I'm going to start ranting and I'm probably going to start swearing. And if we didn't notice, she didn't swear at all today. So I am going to wrap that one up here. But I think those are just 3 things to really stop for a sec and just clock, like, where is my mentality and my mindset with those things? Because I think becoming aware of them is the first thing, and then just becoming open-minded to some of them. If we think about that like good and bad food thing, we want to be really open-minded to that, because otherwise it just keeps us trapped in this really shitty cycle. But then also just understanding and kind of clocking, and it might be a little bit of an ego hit, especially that last one of like, what am I deeming a good week? Most people don't want to stop and go, yeah, shit, that's me. Like, that's not a good trait to have. That's not a good thing to be doing. And I am doing it. It can be hard on our ego. It can be hard to kind of admit that to ourselves. But I think just understanding those 3 things and then having the awareness of where you personally are sitting with those things is the first step towards transcending them. And then, like I said before, the more education and things we can get, the more we can really actually start to transcend them. And I've said it before and I'll say it a million times, I'm envisioning so many Eat Like Ruby girls that are listening to this episode right now going, yeah, I used to do all that and now I've come so far. And that's unreal. Like, that's literally why I'm here. And just let that be evidence and let that be a permission slip to someone. If you are a beginner or you are struggling with some of these things, understanding that learning them and doing the work is going to eventually move you towards that position. And it's absolutely work worth doing, and it's absolutely a position worth getting to. That is enough from me today. I will be back on Friday. Thank you guys so much for listening. Like always, please take your screenshots of the pod, chuck them on your Instagram stories, tag Eat Like Ruby. I love seeing them, and I really want the podcast to just get out to more women so we can help more women with all of this stuff. So please help me, help you, help them. I will be back on Friday. Thank you all so much.